So, Torchinsky Files, episode... I don't even... Hey everybody! I know it's been a while, but we're back here at the Torchinsky Files in my basement full of crap, and of course I still have many exciting, idiotic things to talk to you about, so let's just go ahead and do it. So this time, I want to talk about something really interesting, because it's got to do with cars and old video games. It's a driving game, and it's significant because this particular driving game was probably the very first real moral panic that was seen in all of video games. And this is the kind of thing that would come up over and over and still comes up about modern video games. But this is really where it all started. The first time everybody really got freaked out by video games, and specifically violence in video games, happened way back in 1976 with a game called Death Race. Now you think with Death Race, you think, what are they worried about violence? Death Race, it sounds fun and sweet, like a hug festival. But it's actually not exactly. But it's got an interesting story behind it. And this is the, by the way, the graphics, the artwork on the side of the cabinet for Death Race. And you can see there's looks like a C2 Corvette, a very early Corvette there. And then we've got what looks like, I think it's like a Challenger, it's hard to tell, it's got a lot of stuff taken up. And they're both being driven by these kind of death-like figures in cloaks through a winding road in a graveyard. So clearly, mortality is a crucial part of this game. But let's talk about this game a little bit. So, it's a company called Exedy. Exedy was one of the big manufacturers, or one of the bigger manufacturers back in the 70s and 80s of arcade games. They even actually made a home computer called the Exedy Sorcerer, which wasn't really a hit. They did a lot of interesting stuff. They might be best known for a game called Venture, which was like an 80s game. You played like a happy face with a bow and arrow who crawled through dungeons and stuff. It was fun. Anyway, Exedy was one of the big players, and early in the 70s, they were pretty early to come on making video games. You know, you had basically the Atari Pong in the very early 70s, like around, like, what, 72 or so, and before that, I guess 71, you had Computer Space, and then Pong, and then everybody started making Pong clones, and then you started to get a little more variety in games. Atari had some very early driving games in the early 70s, and then eventually, Exedy had this game. This was around 76, I think. I really should check. So a game called Destruction Derby. Very simple game, pretty fun. Basically, you're driving cars into each other. It's a destruction derby, a demolition derby. You have cars on the screen. You see you've got two players. Everybody's got a steering wheel. They just drive cars into each other. Very straightforward, very basic kind of early game. Now, Exedy was not a huge company at the time, so they actually licensed this game to a company called Chicago Coin, which had been making pinball games and coin-operated games for years, and they changed the name a little to Demolition Derby from Destruction Derby. Same basic idea. But they gave Chicago Coin all the rights to the game. Same basic idea, changed the cabinet, but Chicago Coin now has the rights to market and sell this game. Exclusive rights. However, there was a problem. Chicago Coin was actually running out of business, and everything kind of hit the crapper, and Chicago Coin wasn't able to produce these games anymore, but they still had the exclusive contract to produce them. So Exedy was kind of stuck. They'd spent all this time developing a game, but they just sold off their rights to build it, and now they couldn't even get any revenue from it, because the company they licensed it to went out of business and isn't building games. So what they did is they thought, well, let's get Howell Ivy over here, the guy who designed the game, get him to go back and change what we can change so we have a new game that we can produce and sell on our own. Now here's the thing though, this wasn't as easy as it would be today because there wasn't like a program you could change. Back in the 70s, the early to mid 70s, most of these games were what they called discrete logic games. They didn't have a central processor, CPU, like most computers or pretty much everything does today. So in a computer with like a central processor, you've got a main CPU and a program, and if you wanted to change it, you could change the program and just change like a ROM chip on the board and it would be good to go. But in this kind of game, the machine itself was the program. They actually used discrete little integrated circuits to actually control the logic and functioning of the game. So like, for example, this little integrated schematic here, the circuit schematic, this is what controls one of the characters in this game. This is what the motherboard looks like. Look at all these little chips, and there's no one main CPU. It's not like a centralized, government with a central processor. It's like a collective. So everything works together. The machine is the program, is what I'm saying. So to make a change was a big deal. You'd have to either re-engineer the whole game or just change the minimal amount you could. And that's what Mr. Howell Ivy did. So the end result was Death Race, and what he did was he changed one of the opponent's cars, or the other opponent cars that you try to run into in the game. He changed them from cars to these little humanoid figurines that they called gremlins. And he changed the wrecked car graphic from a wrecked car to a little tombstone. And then they changed some of the sounds, so the end result was a game that looked like this. It was a very clever way to do it. They didn't actually have to change any of the logic of the game. They only had to change the 2 chips that actually held the pixel patterns for the images on screen, what you'd call a sprite nowadays. So it was a really clever way to change the whole tone of the game. Then it was no longer a destruction or demolition derby, it was driving a car into these little gremlin figures, killing them and leaving a tombstone and trying not to hit the tombstone and drive around. The gameplay, exact same, but the tone was entirely different. The look of the game had, the kind of graphic with the death figures and things like that. And this game, because you were driving into these little figures over and over again, people freaked the F out. An AP reporter happened to see the game in Seattle and started this a moral panic, really. They described what's going on as these skeletal figures bear a strong resemblance to people. Those are referring to the little gremlins. When hit by a car, they emit a shrieking sound, something like the scream of a child. I've heard this shrieking sound before. It's really pushing it to say it sounds like the scream of a child. And some of these articles were a little more, okay, death race knocking them dead, and some people saying things like, it's kind of stupid, kind of fun, but there's always this undercurrent of this panic. So when they say Death Race video game outrages U.S. Safety Council, that's the National Safety Council. I guess it's just some organization that advocates, be careful on the stairs, or don't run with scissors, or whatever the hell the National Safety Council tells you to do. Don't go to bed with a wet head. They have a quote from Gerald Dreesen, who's a behavioral scientist and manager of the Council's research department. He said about the game, one of its most insidious and probably unrecognized characteristics is a shift from imaginary visual images of destruction, as you have in TV violence, to actual behavioral actions taken by the player. So I think what he's getting at is a little bit of convoluted way of saying you're not just watching violence happen. Because look, there's been violence in TV and movies since day one. There have been movies about war. This is the 70s. Then he also says, the person is no longer just a spectator, but now an actor in creating the violence. So that's where they're really panicking, because you're not just watching carnage, you're participating in carnage. You're driving over the little gremlin guys. Now, let's see, the Automobile Club of Southern California actually weighed in as well and said, we're trying to teach drivers how to take evasive maneuvers on the road, like avoiding pedestrians. And here's this morbid game comes along and it encourages people to develop the opposite skill, how to hit people. See, the crazy thing about this is the amount of seriousness that this game is being taken is absurd. This is what the game looked like. This does not feel anything like actually driving. You have an overhead view, you're moving around with a steering wheel, but that's where all the similarities to driving ends. This is by no means teaching people the skill of running anybody over. And the idea that somehow this action can lead to a desire to actually kill a normal human, of course, by modern standards feels absurd, but people were serious about this back in the day. This was a real panic. And let's look again. So this is the figure that they're saying is human-like. This is what they say is the human-like figure that's too realistic. It's like an 8x8 set of pixels. It's compared to modern games. And again, there's still these charges leveled at modern games that they incite violence or they encourage people to do violent things. Modern games are extremely realistic and extremely graphic. When you murder somebody in a modern game, it looks basically like it. But there's still never really been good evidence to tie these things together. There have been some studies that have suggested this, but I believe overall, based on the research I've done, most studies say there's not a clear correlation and it's not really anything to worry about, and especially at this level. This is not at all the kind of thing you think people would get panicked about. But they did. They got very panicked. Just the idea of driving over anything humanoid really freaked people out. And just to give you a real idea of what this was like, now this game is actually really hard to play nowadays because it was made with those discrete components and there's no central processor, it's extremely difficult to emulate. There are no really good emulators for it, but somebody has basically made a recreation of the game. Alright, one player. Alright, here we go. There's my car, there's the little gremlin guys. I'm gonna try to hit him. I want to hear the shriek. Damn it. There you are. That was a shriek. That's the shriek of a child. Is that really the shriek of a child? Let's hear it again. There you are. That was a shriek. So this is basically it. You chase down the people, and they're not people. I'm sorry, the gremlins. They were very careful to call them gremlins because I think even Exedy understood that people might freak out if it was flat out people, but it's not. They're just little gremlin guys. This is it. This is what caused the moral panic. And the thing is, it's actually pretty fun. With 2 people, it's especially fun. If you have the real controls, it's really fun. But it's also, it's really simple. This doesn't really incite my bloodlust. I don't know, maybe I'm an unusually calm person, but I think I'm going to be able to go about my life and not run anybody over. I think I can tell the difference. But apparently not everybody always thought that. And in the end, though, all the publicity really helped Death Race. It was by far the biggest factor in making the game a success, and it's historically relevant because, of course, this was the first real moral panic in video games, and it's what really brought this kind of, brought video games into a mainstream for a lot of people, even though it was in kind of a negative way. And, of course, that first mainstream video game moral panic was a driving game. So driving games have a great history in just making everybody, very uncomfortable.